welcome again. This is the right place if you're here for the shifting landscape of leadership, teams and performance. And I'm delighted to be joined by a couple of colleagues who teach on our Senior Leader Apprenticeship Programme. They're going to be taking you through some elements of this theme as much as we can manage in the short time that we have today. So the first thing that I'd like to do is introduce my colleagues to you this morning. So starting with Elinor, please could you introduce yourself?
So good morning, everybody. My name is Elinor O'Connor and I'm a Professor of Work Psychology at Alliance Manchester Business School. And with my colleague Geoff, I deliver the course unit on organisational behaviour for the postgraduate diploma in senior leadership.
Hi everyone, my name is Geoff Thomas and I'm a Professor of Organisational Psychology, co-lead the unit with Elinor, and I conduct research, teach and executive education and training on leadership and teams.
Thank you, Geoff. I'm Kieran, so I'm going to be hosting today. I work on the client relations team, along with my colleague that I'll introduce in a minute. If you do have your camera switched on or your microphone switched on, please, we are recording this session, so it's probably worth turning those off just until we get to the and I'm getting a lot of feedback there, just until we get to the Q&A section. So if everybody can make sure you've got your microphones turned off, that'd be fantastic. Thank you. Avila, please, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Kieran. Hi, everyone. I'm Avila, and like Kieran said, I work in client relations for the postgraduate diploma. Nice to see you all.
Okay, thank you to my wonderful colleagues. And if you want to pop a few words in the chat about where you're coming in from and what you hope to get from that session today, that would be great. So without further ado, we're going to do a little introduction to where this topic is situated in one of our courses, and then we're going to get straight on to the topic itself, where Ellen is going to talk about some of the background themes, and Geoff's going to talk about the particular relationship between leaders and those they manage. We're going to have a live Q&A, so if you've got questions for either Geoff or Eleanor, please pop them in the chat as we go through. And then just to round off, we'll tell you about where some of this content has sort of come from and a little bit about the programme. If you're interested, if this is the sort of thing that really kind of ticks your boxes and you'd like to find out more, we actually have a programme that's built around this and several other themes. So moving on to that programme, we offer here what's called a Senior Leader Apprenticeship Programme for aspiring senior leaders here at Alliance Manchester Business School. And there's about 6 core units. And again, for any of those joining late, if I could ask you to put your videos off and microphones off, that just improves the experience for everybody. And we are recording this session. So I won't speak to all of the topics, the different units, but have a look there. The one that we're actually going to focus on today is organisational behaviour and performance. But I think you'll see a lot of these are very pertinent, very topical. We like to blend these universal themes that are ever present for leadership and management of people and organisations, but actually put a current spin on them to understand how they're situated in the current context of modern life. So looking particularly at this organisational behaviour and performance, this is just a very brief summary of some of the headlines that you might cover if you came and studied with us on this unit. But without much more of ado, what I'm going to do is hand over now to Eleanor, who's going to take you through some of the key themes of this topic.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Kieran. So good morning, everybody. I think most of us know what organisational behaviour is concerned with, but just for the sake of clarity, it's worth defining what we mean by organisational behaviour. And essentially, the field of organisational behaviour is concerned with understanding the behaviour of individuals and groups within organisations, and importantly, how the behaviour of those people has an impact on the organisation's performance. And of course, what we're also then trying to do is, by understanding how individuals and groups influence organisational performance, we're going to try and apply that knowledge to enhance the effectiveness, the productivity, essentially the success of an organisation. So some of the sort of key themes that are considered in the field of organisational behaviour, and indeed that Geoff and I cover in our course unit, include things like understanding motivation at work, And that's about understanding the motivation of employees, understanding the motivation of people who perhaps work for you, report to you. But it's also understanding too your own motivation, and particularly, for example, what motivates you as current and future leaders in your organizations. We look at topics like team working, and particularly the leadership of teams. And we also, too, look at one particularly important theme at the moment, which we're hearing a lot about in the media, which is the issue of work-related stress and its impact both on individual employees, but also the organisation more broadly. Now, importantly, what we try to do in this course unit is to consider these topics in organisational behaviour in the context of contemporary trends and challenges in the world of work. And for the next few minutes, what I want to do is just to highlight some examples of those key trends that we're seeing now in the world of work in organizations that we can then use as we can then consider things like leadership, team working, well-being at work, and so on in the context of those trends. So one of the first trends we're going to look at is the issue of the aging workforce. Now, I think we're all very well aware that the population at large, the general population in the UK and globally, is aging. And of course, that reflects a combination of things like people simply living longer, but also, too, we've seen falling birth rates in recent decades. And in the same way, we're seeing that trend towards an aging population being reflected in the workplace. And it's interesting that if we look at, say, the case in the UK particularly, the Office for National Statistics, when they look at the age profile of the UK, their statistics show that about 20 years ago, roughly 65% of the working age population in the overall population represented about 65% of the general population. In other words, if we take the general population, about 65% of people were of working age back in about 2005. Today, that figure has dropped to 61%. And it is projected that in about 10 years' time, about 58% of the population will be of working age. So what we're seeing is essentially a shrinking number of people of working age in the general population. And this, of course, has clearly important implications for organizations. Most importantly, it means that organizations will need to think about recruiting and retaining older workers beyond the traditional retirement age to ensure that they have sufficient numbers of staff to actually carry out their business. And from an organizational behavior point of view, what we then need to think about is that in the context of an aging workforce, we need to think about issues such as, are there differences, for example, in the motivation, in the work performance, in the productivity of younger versus older workers? What about health considerations for older workers? And also things to like general human resource management implications of employing older workers. So things like, are the needs of older workers different compared to those of younger workers? Also, too, what are the attitudes of other employees and managers to employing older people? So these are some of the sorts of themes that we discuss in the context of this very real and present and continuing trend of an aging general population and an aging workforce in particular. The next theme that I want to talk about, again, one that we're all quite familiar with, which is being extensively discussed in the media, is the whole issue of home and hybrid working. And obviously, post the pandemic, there has been a lot of interest and a lot of discussion in organisations and from workers as well about the potential benefits, but also the potential disadvantages of moving to home and hybrid working. And I think it's fair to say that in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, there was a general assumption that, working from home and so-called hybrid working, where people do a mix of home and office-based work, that was a trend that was here to stay. We had that overnight sort of transition to working from home during the pandemic. And in a sense, the conclusion was that trend would be something that would continue. Now, interestingly, this is a debate which is really continuing to evolve all the time. So I think in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, there was this widespread assumption that everybody would continue to work from home, and that organizations would embrace that. And particularly a lot of organizations were of the view that from a business perspective, it made sense. They could reduce costs associated with office space and so on if they had people home working or hybrid working. But this is something that's in a constant state of flux. Over the last 18 months or so, we've seen a lot of interest in this topic. And I don't think we've yet reached a fixed position about working from home. And particularly, you'll probably be aware that in recent sort of the last 9 months or so, we've seen a lot of organizations coming out actually requiring people to come back to the office. So employees tend to like home working because of the advantages and flexibility it gives them. But organizations worry about home working. Does it have an impact on productivity? Does it affect people's motivation, for example? And we're seeing something of a pushback from some organizations, particularly in things like the banking sector. Also, too, interestingly, in the tech sector. So recently, we've had companies like Apple requiring that their employees come into the office at least 2 or 3 days a week. And perhaps most ironically of all, very recently, in fact, Zoom, who made so much profit essentially during the pandemic, during work from home with their technology, has actually now announced that they want their employees back in the office. So this is a trend that we're still getting to grips with. We're still seeing how this evolves. We're still seeing how it's going to work out. And there is this tension on the one hand between employees liking home working, but then organizations having concerns about it. Again, that's an example of a trend that we look at in some detail in our course unit, and we consider all the organizational behavior themes within the context of that trend. So things like motivation, the leadership of remote teams, what are the impact of home working, for example, what are the implications for things like well-being at work, people's performance at work, and so on. And then the third and final theme, I just want to give an example of today, is the whole issue of automation and AI at work. Again, this is something that we've seen in organizations emerging over particularly the last 5 years or so. It's really intensified. We're seeing it in areas like finance, so-called fintech. We're seeing it in the law sector, where the legal profession is increasingly adopting automation, so-called legal tech. We're also seeing the use of AI and automation, for example, in healthcare. But it's something that's really taken off. The whole discussion and debate has really taken off probably in the last 9 months or so, particularly with the advent of things like generative AI platforms, things like ChatGPT and so on. And again, an example of this very recent headline just from last month from the Financial Times, where a number of security companies now struggling to recruit people as security guards. And what they're doing is they're using essentially robot technology to provide surveillance of areas. And if they detect any sort of form of intrusion, any breach of security, then they will essentially, for want of a better word, liaise with human operators who can come and investigate. So again, the whole issue of automation and AI, major theme for organizations. We need to consider what are the implications of automation and AI, things like well-being at work, performance at work, motivation, and so on. So I'm going to draw a close there, and I'm going to hand over to Geoff, who's going to talk about one particular aspect of the leadership of teams that we discuss in our course unit.
One of the key themes that we focus on the program is the manager-employee relationship, and I do a lot of research on this topic as well. And the reason for that is that it's the most important workplace relationship. Our research shows that having a good quality relationship with your manager has a big impact on a range of really important outcomes such as employee performance, higher engagement, better employee well-being, as well as salary and career progression as well. In fact, it actually acts as a lens through which we see the entire organisation. Employees feel more attached, they feel more committed, they feel more identified with the organisation when they have a better quality relationship with their manager. So the cliche is true, is that most people don't leave their jobs, they actually leave their managers. So the outcome of sort of this is to sort of think about what kind of relationships do managers and employees prefer? And that's an interesting question to ask. And my colleagues and I have done a lot of research on this question across sort of different industries and different sectors. And the results clearly show that employees prefer a more personalised approach, an approach that's personalised in the sense that it's tailored to the individual's needs, and it's also tailored to their level of contribution to the group. A personalised approach tends to be preferred by employees because they deem it to be more equitable. The more they put in, the more they get out in that sense. So far fewer employees actually prefer what you could call or class as a sort of more group-oriented approach. Although a sort of a group-oriented approach would entail equal treatment for everybody, the problem with it in employees' eyes is that it seems impersonal and it's not in keeping with how personal relationships normally develop outside of the workplace. So if we sort of think about how that culminates in terms of the different kinds of manager-employee relationships, this personalized approach actually leads to different kinds of relationships. And we can almost view these kinds of relationships along a continuum from sort of lower quality to higher quality. So in lower quality relationships, neither employees nor the manager invests much time and effort. And this leads to a kind of a low trust relationship in which employees essentially work to the employment contract and managers sort of provide little support or recognition in terms of their relationship. In higher quality relationships, both the manager and the employees invest substantial time and effort, and this results in a high trust relationship. So there's a sense of mutual loyalty, mutual support, and also mutual influence as well. And if we look at sort of the prevalence of different kinds of relationships across lots of industries and sectors, research shows that around 80% of managers adopt this personalised approach. So in other words, within the same team, a manager develops substantially different quality relationships with his or her employees. Now, this leads to a paradox because on the one hand, the personalised approach does lead to better performance and engagement, at least for those with better quality relationships. And it's also more equitable. The more you contribute, the better the relationship. On the other hand, it also leads to worse team performance. Why is that? Because it tends to undermine group cohesion. It can be a source of group conflict, and it creates fault lines within the group and the team, where you have an in-group who get on well with the manager and an out-group who don't get on well with the manager. So given this paradox, what is the solution? And don't get me wrong, it's not easy. It's a complex problem. Managers have large teams and they have limited time. And managers can often find it easier to get along and develop better relationships with certain employees than other employees. And often this is for good reasons. But the solution, I think, is to minimize the range of relationship quality in the group, in particular by improving the relationship quality with those employees who you as a leader may find initially difficult to develop a good relationship with. Engaging with those employees and working out what their individual needs are and adapting to those needs means that you provide the kind of support that would improve the relationship for them. Let me give you an example. I was talking to a very senior leader who is leading a business unit of 5,000 people, and she told me about two of her employees who were equally competent. One clearly invested in the relationship and wanted regular feedback and communication. The other liked to work more autonomously and independently and only really wanted to check in on occasions and didn't seem to welcome feedback. And the manager found this frustrating. She realized that she had a much better relationship with the former than the latter. And that was because of the different levels of effort and investment in the relationship. But when she reflected on it, she also realised that a one-size-fits-all approach isn't the best policy, and that each employee sort of had different needs, and if she adapted her style to each of the employees' needs, then that led to a good quality relationship with each of them. So to conclude, it's important to adapt your style as a manager to try to improve the quality of the relationships with all employees, and in doing so, it minimises the problems that are created by substantial variation in relationship quality within the same team. Over to you, Karen.
Apologies, having a slight technical problem there. Luckily, my colleague in the office could hear me and you couldn't, so apologies for that. Thank you for that, Geoff and Elinor. That was really insightful. We've only just very briefly touched on the topic. So I'd like to invite you now, if you've got questions on any of the three themes that Elinor raised, or the relationships between and the preferences for equity or difference in those relationships for Geoff, or any other questions around this sort of topic, please post them in the chat now. I don't know if we've got any questions already because I can't actually see the chat pane. So I'm going to turn to my colleague Avila. Avila, can you see the chat pane from where you are?
I can, Kieran, but we have no questions at the moment in there.
Okay, I think we've actually got a problem with the chat. So I'm going to invite people, if you do want to raise your hand instead to ask a question, I'll invite you to do that now, and we can put on your camera and we can unmute. But while we're waiting for people to do that, I've got a question really for you, Elinor. You mentioned those three topics, the sort of the working from home, the aging workforce, and the rise of AI. Do you see those intersecting as well? Are these sort of discrete areas, or is there a kind of a connection between the two? I'm thinking of, some differences in generation and their preferences for things like working with AI or indeed working remotely.
Yeah, it's a good question, that one, Kieran. I think yes, there will be intersections invariably between these three considerations. I think one of the first ones is, say, in relation to older workers and particularly use of technology. And there is perhaps a widespread assumption, frankly a stereotype, that perhaps older workers are more averse to using technology. They're less comfortable with technology. They're perhaps reluctant to undergo training. They perhaps don't do as well in training courses compared with younger workers. And yet the evidence for that actually is scant. In fact, there is no evidence, for example, that older people are perhaps more concerned or are more averse to using technology. They may have anxieties about using it, but equally, if with appropriate training, they can do well. And I think one of the big issues we see in organizational behavior is there is, as we say, unfortunately, this assumption, quite widespread assumption that what we call this depreciation view of older workers, this idea that as you age, you invariably become less motivated, perhaps, less interested in training, perhaps less committed, and so on. And yet the evidence doesn't bear that out. Now, thankfully, I think organizations are beginning to recognize that that the alternative view is much more appropriate, what we call the kind of conservation view of workers. That is this sort of general philosophy that workers are quite often, we've had to fight quite hard to gain appropriate people into an organization. They are, in a sense, assets that we need to invest in and support. And the same very much applies to older workers. So that, in a sense, by making sort of minor adjustments in the workplace, by considering the different needs of older versus younger workers, we can actually retain and support those older workers who are going to be so vital to ensuring the success of future businesses. And there are many organizations, examples of major blue chip companies who've done this very effectively. One, for example, is BMW in Germany, who's been at a leading edge of this in the last sort of 20 years or so. So yeah, some clear intersections. I think we possibly have some questions in the chat now, do we?
I could see a hand up there from, I think, Rebecca. So Rebecca, can I invite you to come off mute or and put your camera on and ask your question?
Yeah, so I was just thinking about the kind of the personalized manager approach, and yeah, that's definitely something that I do. But how do you, I think it's a really difficult balance between, and it's kind of like with patient care sometimes, you can end up spending a lot of your time on a few patients, and how can you make it equitable in terms of your management in that I've certainly found some of the more tricky people to manage, should we say, take up a lot of your time, and what would your advice be on trying to balance that, really, because that doesn't seem fair for the rest of the team, does it?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I suppose there are obviously, managers are time poor. One thing that sort of often happens, I think, is that sort of when I sort of take leadership development programs and so forth, one of the key things that comes through is the importance of putting more time into actually managing people, and so having time devoted to those that important sort of task. I think in terms of looking at meeting different needs, it's not necessarily about spending more time with one or the other, but to adapt the style depending upon the need. But obviously some employees are perhaps harder to manage than others. And so that becomes a bit of a balancing act. I completely agree. And so spending too much time on one employee would lead to a sense of inequity from others within the team. So I agree with you. I think it is a balancing act where you try to meet others' needs on an individualized basis, but also keeping a sense that overall there's a sense of fairness and a sense of equality. Effectively, we're talking about balancing equity and equality together. And both of those are really important considerations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Geoff. I think we've got, and thank you, Rebecca, for your question. A great question. Clearly a very tough nut to crack. Avila, I think we've got a question in the chat pane now from Sakina. I don't know if you want to summarize that, or thank you.
Yeah, so Sakina has asked, how do you think the advancements in technology and the rise of remote working are impacting the traditional models of leadership? And what new skills or qualities do you think are essential for leaders to succeed in this evolving landscape?
That's a great question. Who would like to pick that up? Elinor, Geoff, or both of you, perhaps?
I think perhaps if Geoff begins, because Geoff is obviously the person with the particular expertise in leadership, but I do have some thoughts on this myself. So perhaps Geoff, if you could open.
Sorry, I couldn't quite catch the question. Sorry.
Okay, so the question was around the rise of technology and remote work and how that's impacting on traditional models of leadership, and any advice of how what might need to change
Right.
to succeed as a leader. Sorry, Sakina, I hope I haven't butchered your question there.
No, that's perfectly fine. Thank you.
So obviously everyone's seen that through the pandemic in terms of the rise of technology, particularly home working, and the use of sort of virtual teams and virtual working. And so from a leadership perspective, the interesting thing is that actually many of our traditional models of leadership that focus more on building the relationship and building trust within the leader-follower relationship are actually even more pertinent when it comes to e-leadership or sort of virtual teams, because the biggest problem we often have with virtual teams is not having the kind of interactions that help to develop and foster trust. And so adopting a more relational style and to try to include the informal communication alongside the more formal communication that often happens through sort of Teams or Zoom and those different kinds of platforms, that actually is the important way to gain trust. So I think the thing that's often lacking that we found throughout the pandemic was the informal interactions. And so to be able to encourage those types of interactions, which are critical to sort of a relational style of leadership, actually works even better in some ways in that context. It's even more important to develop a relational style.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, one of the particular themes we discuss in the organisational behaviour course unit is the whole issue of work-related stress, well-being at work, and so on. And in particular, we look at the role of managers and leaders in essentially enhancing well-being at work. And indeed, we also look at the role too of managers sometimes as potential causes of stress. So we look at this particular issue from a number of perspectives. But one of the things that's quite interesting now is with regard to the debate about working from home from an organisational behaviour perspective, is its implications for the well-being of employees. And I think many of us had the experience during the pandemic of working from home had some advantages in the sense that you didn't have to commute to work. You in a sense got back time during the day that you might otherwise have spent traveling and so on. So there are clearly some advantages from working from home. But the other thing that people reported anecdotally during the pandemic working from home was they lacked those boundaries between work time and home time. And that was, of course, particularly the case for people who were perhaps living in homes where perhaps they were having to share a workspace that was used by other people. Perhaps they were having to work in a kitchen or a shared area, rather than having a space that they could go to and work and then treat as a separate workspace. And we do know that having those boundaries between work and home time are very important for people's essentially psychological well-being. So I think one of the debates with regard to working from home now is to what extent it has benefits, but potentially disadvantages for well-being. And this, of course, is something that leaders and managers need to be acutely aware of, because leaders and managers play a key role, I think, in identifying when people may be experiencing stress or when their well-being may be affected. So I think that's another facet to the sort of leadership skills that are going to be pertinent the more we see working from home and remote working occurring.
Right, thank you. Thank you for that. Can I just add on a question to that? And when I was writing that out, I was thinking about sort of inexperienced leaders and not maybe sort of inexperienced managers or leaders in terms of not building those skills of building relationships and understanding the power of building those relationships. How would someone that is inexperienced or being managed by a leader that's inexperienced build their skills up, or support them to build their skills up, from bottom upwards, or ultimately? Sorry, maybe I've just not kind of questioned that correctly. Does that make sense?
What I heard there was around, how do you help people develop those skills?
Yeah.
So, I don't want to butcher your question.
No, definitely. How do you support people to develop those skills in terms of when they haven't got the experience to build relationships up, or definitely take on your point in terms of home working and the benefits of really understanding the space. But when I put that question forward, it was mainly thinking about what I see happening a lot in organizations now is leaders become leaders, but not necessarily have the experience of understanding how to build and develop relationships. So there's a lot of failure, and failure is fine as long as you learn from that failure. But it's just, how do you enable someone to develop those skills?
I wonder, Geoff, if I may come in and then perhaps hand over to you.
Sure.
Really good point, Sakina. And I think, to be frank, there is a sense in which we sometimes find ourselves having leadership thrust upon us rather than necessarily actively choosing us. And one of the things we look at in our course unit is the concept of, in a sense, the accidental leader, sometimes even the reluctant leader. In other words, somebody who is quite happy in their role, and then somebody comes along and says, we need somebody to fill this position, and you're it, and you find yourself in that position. And that's a very interesting theme, and it's something that we do discuss in the course unit. I think one of the key issues in terms of understanding sort of relevant skills and behaviours is, first of all, as part of the postgraduate diploma, our students have the opportunity to undertake a psychometric assessment. They do a personality assessment, essentially. And this is a really valuable tool in terms of gaining insight into your own particular characteristics, your own particular personality style, your preferences, how you tend to interact with other people. And we do that very much as a development tool for delegates on the course. It's entirely confidential, so the results are known only to you if you come on the course. We have coaches who can discuss those results with you. And I think that's done in an early part of the postgraduate diploma. And then what Geoff and I do is we actually draw on those results as part of our course unit to encourage delegates to think about their own particular style and their preferences and the strengths they have in terms of the contributions they can make to leadership, but also to things that perhaps potentially they need to develop. So I think it's partly about having insight into your own particular style. It's also understanding the science in a sense of, what works and what works well and what works less well, which is, of course, some of the work that Geoff has been presenting earlier on in the webinar today. So I think that's one sort of two particular issues there that can help with that. But it is also about recognizing that sometimes, as we say, people do find themselves having leadership thrust upon them rather than necessarily actively choosing it. Geoff, I'm sure you will have more to add to that, given your expertise in leadership specifically.
Thanks, Elinor. Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I often find that in many organisations, fortunately not all organisations, but in many organisations, there's almost adopting a little bit of a sink or swim type of approach where lower level leaders don't get the level of access to leadership development that sort of more senior level leaders do. And we know that people develop skills through sort of three clear pathways. One is in terms of challenge and experience, so actually being put in a situation where it requires you to develop the skills and learn lessons from your experience while you're going through the difficult situation. And so in that sense, an experienced leaders often need to sort of develop a leadership mindset, which they haven't had in the past, to sort of see leadership as part of their identity, and also to be able to manage themselves and their own emotions, as well as others as well. So it's that difficult one of being able to sort of deal with the stresses and strains of a challenging situation while being able to think about managing other people and leading others as well. We often find that having good role models is really important in terms of that. So if they are led themselves by someone who's a good relational leader, then they can role model that behaviour for others, and that's an excellent way to learn. But also organisations, if they provide mentoring or coaching, can also help an experienced leader through that really difficult transition. And so lastly, obviously, at Manchester, we provide executive education and so forth, and that would be a structured way of taking you through and to be able to help to develop those skills through a leadership development program. And the apprenticeship is one of those programs that we provide that can help, particularly those who are looking to make a transition to a more senior level of leadership.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your response.
Thank you for your question, Sakina. I think they're really interesting there. A couple of concepts there that I'm going to take away about sort of psychometrics and knowing yourself as a leader. I think you said, Elinor, I'd never come across the accidental leader, but never the reluctant leader. Although that does actually start to fit now a few people that from my past. And Geoff, just that idea that the apprenticeship isn't sort of a magic wand, but actually how it fits in that overall structure of support you can give to people wishing to aspire to that next level. Okay, some fantastic questions there, folks. If you've got more questions, because we're pretty much out of time for that question section, please email myself or my colleague Avila. We'll answer your questions after today's event, or we'll forward them to Elinor and Geoff for any comments from them. The slides will be available. I'd like to thank Elinor and Geoff for that section. We're now just going to do a very brief sort of introduction to where some of this material comes from, or if you like that, where you might actually kind of experience some of the unit or some of the themes. And I'm handing over to Avila, who's going to take you through the Senior Leader Apprenticeship.
Thanks, Kieran. And Elinor and Geoff. So yeah, like Kieran said, some of the content that we discussed today features in our postgraduate diploma in senior leadership. So in terms of the programme itself, it is designed for middle level managers aspiring to those senior leader roles, and it's based on developing the knowledge, skills and behaviour of our current and future leaders. So the program itself is levy funded. So for those of you employed in an organisation paying into the apprenticeship levy, 100% of the fees will be covered by the levy. It's 18 months long, and there is the option to top up to a master's level. So this would involve essentially handing over the postgraduate diploma, completing another 6 months of study, and finishing with a master's level in senior leadership. Of course, as it is an apprenticeship, you are studying as you work, so applying what you learn to your work environment immediately. And what we have on the screen at the moment is some of those topics. So of course, today we touched on some of the organisational behaviour and performance, as well as some of the leadership and culture elements as well. So why come to the University of Manchester? In terms of our teaching, so there is the consistent high-level teaching from award-winning academics. So we've been lucky enough to hear from Geoff and Elinor today. So some of the kind of insight to the type of teaching you would be fortunate enough to receive here at the University of Manchester in the business school. The course is designed to challenge you, so you will become more reflective and self-aware as a leader. So one of the kind of elements that we cover in the program is the strategic element. So intentional leadership, moving beyond just your operational level of excellence that you may be operating at the moment, to consider that real strategic approach to your work. As touched on, because you're studying as you work, you can apply what you're learning directly to the workplace. So both yourself and your employers and colleagues seeing that immediate benefit of you undertaking the program. We've recently designed the program, so this is new design, but also the content that we cover. So we're looking at very topical leadership issues that you will face as a senior leader in today's, as we've touched on today, ever-changing landscape. In terms of entry routes, so we keep it fairly simple. It's usually a degree in 3. So if you have a first degree of 2-1 or higher, we're looking for at least 3 years of managerial experience. Without the degree or lower than a 2-2, then we're looking for at least 5 years experience. And like we said, the degree is not compulsory, but we are looking for the 5 years. The reason that we do ask this is quite a bit of the course is based around peer discussion, and we want you to have the relevant experience to draw upon. So doing the course at the right time is a big part for us. As we've mentioned, it is covered by the apprenticeship levy. Therefore, we do have ESFA rules and eligibility factors that we need to consider. The best way for us to do this is we have created an online eligibility checker that you can use for free. This covers some of those kind of factors, and it helps us really see if this is the right fit for you in the right time. And we will pop this in the chat, but again, it will be included in these slides as well. So we would encourage anyone with an interest in the program. This is a really key first step in checking your eligibility. And yeah, just in terms of myself and Kieran, as we've mentioned earlier, we do lead on the initial kind of queries regarding the program. So please don't hesitate in getting in contact with us. We're fairly prompt getting back with any questions. I'm more than happy to kind of arrange calls and discuss your suitability, and any questions that you may have that we haven't covered today, more than happy to help with those. Over to you, Kieran.
Thanks, Avila. And my fabulous colleague Abby has put in the chat a link to the eligibility checker. It really is very simple. It takes about 5 minutes. It's a series of about 10 or 11 questions. Ask you, are you PAYE? Are you a sole trader? There's some things that we can't negotiate on because it's a kind of a nationally funded program. So if you're interested in joining the program, click on the link. Check whether or not you're eligible. If you are, great, we can have a conversation about how the program might be suitable. If you're not, don't worry. We have about 16 other short courses and a whole variety of topics that might actually suit you instead. So our contact details are on screen now. They'll also be in the slides that we send out to you. All that remains for me today is to thank my fabulous colleagues. I'd like to thank Elinor and Geoff. I know we just got a tiny window into some of the work that you do and some of the teaching that you do. But again, as usual, every day's a school day, and I learned some things, particularly about the reluctant leader. So thank you very much for that. To my fabulous colleague Avila for rounding us off there, and to the ever-present Abby for being in the background and supporting this webinar. So all that remains on our behalf is to say thank you very much for joining us today. And if you're watching it back on the recording, thank you for watching the recording. The eligibility checker will still work, and our email addresses will still work if you're watching this away from the live event. So without any further ado, I'd like to say thank you for joining us today. Have a very pleasant rest of the day. We appreciate your attention for the last 45 minutes. And if I could invite my colleagues just to stay on whilst people leave, and we can just have a quick wrap up. Have a very pleasant day, everybody.